We're going to hear a story from a book of stories, Friedman's Fables, written by Rabbi Edwin Friedman. This story is about the friendly forest. Once upon a time in the friendly forest, there lived a lamb who loved to graze and frolic about. One day, a tiger came into the forest and said to the animals, "I would like to live among you." They were delighted, for unlike some of the other forests, they had no tiger in their woods. The lamb, however, had some apprehensions, which, being a lamb, she expressed sheepishly. She expressed to her friends, but they said, "Do not worry. We will talk to the tiger," and explain that one of the conditions for living in the forest is that you must also let the other animals live in the forest. So the lamb went about her life as usual, but it was not long before the tiger began to growl and make threatening gestures and menacing motions. Each time the frightened lamb went to her friends and said, "It is very uncomfortable for me here in the forest." But her friends just reassured her, "Do not worry, that's just the way tigers behave." Every day she went about her life. The lamb tried to remember this advice, hoping that the tiger would find someone else to growl at. And it is probably correct to say that the tiger did not really spend all or even most of its time stalking the lamb. Still, the lamb found it increasingly difficult to remove the tiger from her thoughts. Sometimes she would just catch it out of the corner of her eye, but that seemed to be enough to disconcert her whole day, even if the cat was just asleep. Soon, the lamb found that she was actively looking for the tiger. Some days or weeks would even go by with its intrusive went by between the intrusive actions. Yet somehow the tiger always seemed to just be there. Eventually, the tiger's existence became a part of the lamb's existence. When she tried to explain this to her friends, however, they pointed out that no harm had really befallen her and that perhaps she was just being a little too sensitive. So the lamb tried again to put the tiger out of her mind. "Why," she said to herself, "should I let my relationship with just one member of the forest ruin my relationships with all the others?" But every now and then, usually when she was least prepared, the tiger would give her another start. Finally, the lamb just could not take any more. She decided that as much as she loved the forest and her friends more than she had loved any other forest or any other friends, the cost was too great. So she went to the other animals in the woods and said goodbye. Her friends would not hear of it. "This is silly," they said. "Nothing has happened. You're still in one piece. You just need to remember, a tiger is a tiger." They repeated this. "Surely this is the nicest forest in the world. We really like you very much. We would be very sad if you left." Though it must be admitted that several of the animals were beginning to wonder what the lamb might be doing to contribute to the tiger's aggressiveness. "Then," said two of the animals in the friendly forest, "surely this whole thing can be worked out. We're all reasonable here. Stay calm. This is probably just some misunderstanding that can be easily resolved if we all sit down together and communicate." The lamb, however, had several misgivings about such a meeting. First of all, if her friends had explained away the tiger's behavior by simply saying it was a tiger's nature to behave that way, why did they think that communication with the tiger would mean it would change its nature? Second, thought the lamb, such meetings, well-intentioned as they might be, usually try to resolve such problems with compromise. Now, while the tiger might agree to growl less, and indeed might even succeed in reducing some of its aggressive behavior, what would she, the lamb, be expected to give up in return? Be more accepting of the tiger's growling? There was something wrong, thought the lamb, with the notion that an agreement is equal If the invasive creature agrees to be less invasive and the invaded one agrees to tolerate some invasion. She tried to explain this to her friends, but being very reasonable animals, they assured her that the important thing was communication. Keep communicating. Perhaps the tiger just didn't understand the ways of lamb. Don't be so sheepish, they said. Speak up strongly when he does these things. And thus it was. When one of the other animals, a less subtle, a less unconcerned animal, spoke up. I've never heard of anything so ridiculous. If you want a lamb and a tiger to live in the same forest, you have to cage the bloody tiger. Thus ends our fable. This has been a particularly difficult couple of weeks for the leaders here at this fellowship. We have learned that children and families in our congregation have been harmed. Boundaries were crossed and trust was broken. And if you don't want to believe me, then I don't know what to do about that. You see, part of your work here is to trust me. It's to trust the leaders that you have elected. And I know this might not always be easy, but it's part of the work of any community that you're part of. I also want you to know that my work is not to convince you that I'm trustworthy. My work is to conduct myself in ways that earn your trust. Because I don't have time to convince anybody of anything. I'm too busy attending to some metaphorical laundry. Here's what I mean. Years ago, my teacher taught us that we should not be too hasty when dealing with conflict. This is a very important lesson for martial artists. Don't rush in. Instead, he taught us to take our time and let things calm down first, and then attend to the matter. He likened conflict to mud on your coat. If you get mud on your coat and you immediately start trying to brush it off, it will just smear and make a bigger mess. But if you allow time to let the mud dry, then the mud is easily brushed off. That makes sense. That's a good lesson. But what if, because this is the way my mind works, what if it's not mud on your coat? What if it's blood? Because if you have blood on fabric, you have to clean it right away. You have to soak it in cold water, maybe use some hydrogen peroxide, rub some soap into the fabric. You cannot just let it sit there because it will become a permanent stain. Does that mean that my teacher was wrong? No. It just means that he had not done as much laundry as I have. So I took my teacher's lesson and I added to it my lived experience. So now when dealing with conflict, I have to first determine, is it blood or is it mud? If it's mud, minor concerns, minor differences, I try to let the situation cool down before I address it. But if it is blood, I will act fast. What's this difference? Well, how do I tell? Mud is harmless. It's messy, it's complex, but it's really not likely to compromise the integrity of the people involved. Blood is a sign of danger, of damage. Blood is any time that if I were to let it sit, it will cause the situation to become a permanent stain. And blood takes immediate care and persistence. You first check for any wounds, stop the bleeding, and then begin cleaning up. Are you with me? Yeah. So over the past couple of weeks, the leaders here, the board members of the fellowship, had to deal with a situation that required strong and swift action, because it was a situation that could harm the integrity of this fellowship. It could distract us from our mission. And so they sought to place limits and establish boundaries. Ooh, boundaries, limits. Wait a minute. Are we talking like the stifling of free thought and expression? Isn't this supposed to be a place about tolerance and acceptance? Let me explain about boundaries and boundary crossings. Boundaries help individuals know where one person ends and another person begins. Boundary crossings happen when one person moves into another person's physical, emotional, or mental space. Sometimes it happens by accident. And that is when we apologize and amend our behaviors and work to not do it again. But sometimes it happens by design. Hands go where they should not go. Bodies go where they are not welcome. Coercion, intimidation, threats. These are all boundary crossings. It can be very hard for people who were taught that their body is not their own, or who were taught that they do not have the same rights as the larger and louder people. That means that sometimes for these people, the setting and maintaining of boundaries can feel very uncomfortable. In congregations, it can feel very uncomfortable to set boundaries because we are afraid that it might not feel nice. And most of us are coming here wanting to be nice. And this is exactly what a boundary crossing person will take advantage of. Poorly defined, poorly maintained boundaries. I want to point out that some boundary crossers are very charming. Bill Clinton. And some trade in pathos. They might convince their target that any boundaries don't really apply in this situation. Those boundaries, those are for lesser beings, not enlightened, liberated people like us. Some boundary crossers will explain that the boundaries are keeping them from their happiness and sense of well-being. But remember, if one person's happiness comes at the cost of another person's dignity and well-being, it is not a fair trade. What about us here in this congregation? Don't we have principles and covenant? And aren't we free and enlightened? I mean, what if boundaries serve to limit and interfere with my search for truth and meaning? As spelled out in our fourth principle. Well, there are also the words free and responsible. And that brings us back to, again, if one person's search for truth and meaning comes at the cost of another person's dignity and well-being, it is not a fair trade. It's neither free from harm or a responsible exchange. What about acceptance of one another, as expressed in our third principle? Aren't limits and boundaries a kind of intolerance, a judging kind of process, a lack of acceptance? And this is when it comes down to the difference between the person and the person's behavior. We can accept that a person is the way they are, But we do not have to accept all of their behaviors, because there are behaviors and actions we must not tolerate and cannot accept. You cannot have a safe space if someone is making threats and acting aggressive. And this is why your leaders, well before I got here, had developed a policy and a set of procedures for dealing with disruptive behaviors. Well, what about justice and equity and compassion and human relations? I mean, that's the second principle. I want to say that clearly defined and maintained boundaries are compassionate. They help to clearly identify where one person ends and another person begins, so that we can place our compassion where it is truly needed. Well, then what about our covenant? In the covenant you have written, it says that you will bring concerns directly to one another, and that is good. But what is implicit in that statement is that the expectation that both parties are fully equal, equal in status, equal in power. And frankly, not all people here really hold equal power. Our children do not hold the same abilities and status as our adults. And even between individual adults, if one person has threatened another person in a display of aggression, then the threatened person might not feel quite as secure, might not feel quite as equal. Sometimes it might be like a matter of a lion and a tiger. So the leaders of this congregation recently realized and recognized that vulnerable people had been harmed. And so they worked to place limits and establish boundaries. It was sad work. It involved respecting privacy and holding confidence, but being careful not to create more secrets. That's referring back to what's printed in your order of service. Privacy is held to protect dignity. Confidence is held to protect the vulnerable. Secrets are held to protect the powerful. They were careful not to create more secrets. And this was hard. But here's some good news. This is a place where people can do hard things. This is a place where people have done hard things. And this is a place where people will do hard things. I know this each time we come together. And this is what gives me hope. May it be so. And blessed be.